This is the AM Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of having Jason Horsley to discuss his new book, The Secret Life of Movies, Schizophrenic and Shamanic Journeys in American Cinema. How are you doing today, Jason?
I'm pretty good, Miguel. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good. Thank you very much for coming on the show. When did the schizophrenic theme first creep into American cinema?
That's something that I only discovered in the process of writing the book, because it only became really obvious, I would say, in the last 30 years or so, maybe in the 70s was when it really came all the way to the surface with films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Taxi Driver and what have you. And then, of course, more recently with films like The Matrix and Dark City and Fight Club, the theme was all the way on the surface. So I guess you could say it was films like this that inspired me to present this thesis. But then once I did begin to work on it, I cast my gaze back in time, and I discovered, at least to my own satisfaction, that the first signs of this schizophrenic undercurrent, if you will, of American cinema goes back to as far as the 30s. And speaking in terms of genres, because obviously one could pick individual movies that were schizophrenic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for example, or Fritz Lang's M, but my approach isn't so much related to the subject matter as to the subtext. So it might not be in the story or the characters or anything. There might not be an obviously schizophrenic element, but in the what I call the occult text, the hidden thematic content of a film. So, for example, in the 30s, so we're really almost talking like the beginning of movies as we know them, because sound only came in 1927. So, really, pretty much the start of cinema as it is today, as this entertainment medium. The 30s, we had the screwball comedy with actors like Henry Fonda or James Stewart and Cary Grant, and the basic sort of elements of the screwball comedy were this very straight-laced guy who's very uptight, very serious, academic, or repressed, sexually repressed, or insecure, what have you, and this crazy dame who would come into his life and just turn his life upside down. So you've got films like The Lady Eve or Bringing Up Baby, and this is basically, it's a sort of pattern, a sort of the basic structure of these films, even though they have different stories. That's the basic, the theme of it. Recently it was done in something like Something Wild, was a sort of update of that, with the same basic idea. You've got this person, this man who has a very rigidly controlled, structured life, but it's kind of dead and lifeless, and then this crazy broad comes rushing into his life and upturns everything, and of course opens his heart and all the rest of it, But there can be a dark edge to it. And The Lady Eve, for example, the crazy screwball dame is also kind of femme fatale. She's a con woman who's supposed to actually fleece this guy, but she falls in love with him. So there was a dark edge to it even then, and this then evolved. And I don't think this has been written about anywhere else, but to me, it's a very clear evolution into the film noir, in which instead of the straight, repressed male and the screwball dame, you had the sort of down on his luck, seedy, run-down male and the femme fatale. But the same kind of element. You've got this irrational presence that in the film noir, the Dark Age had come all the way to the surface. This was by the time World War II, had begun, and so there was definitely a darker edge to the collective consciousness was beginning to become visible. That's much more obviously a depiction of the emergence of the other. So the basic idea of schizophrenic cinema is that it's showing us this conflict or this tension in our psyche between our conscious, rational selves and the unconscious, the id, which is this unruly, powerful force in our lives that we try to keep out, but that eventually comes rushing through and basically undoes all our best efforts to maintain control in our lives.
And you would equate the id with the shadow, Jung's shadow, something that just comes out and, eventually will come out and take its toll on us?
I wouldn't necessarily equate the two. I mean, I've used the id kind of loosely in terms of the unconscious, whereas, of course, Freud actually used it closer to the shadow in the sense that it was all these really primal urges and violence, and I think it had a somewhat negative connotation, which, of course, the shadow by definition is, although it's not necessarily negative qualities, it's all the qualities that we deny in ourselves. They might even be good qualities, but we just aren't comfortable with them. So we push them into the unconscious, and they sort of take on this form like a shadow. Literally, a shadow is our own form in negative, but because it's specific to us, whereas the unconscious is a very general, undifferentiated kind of area of suppressed or forgotten material. I mean, everything is in our unconscious pretty much, except what we're thinking right now. But then there's a large part of what's unconscious in this moment that we can access if we choose to point the laser beam at it, let's say. But then there's this whole area that we can't access even if we want to, so we don't actually know it's there except through its effects. The shadow is specifically those areas that we've pushed most deepest down into the unconscious, that we've most disowned, and so they've gathered together in this area of deepest denial as the other, as the doppelganger, as the adversary, what have you. And so then that id matter, which is the shadow, as you point out, it comes to us from without. It's like it takes form. Because it's such a potent element of our psyche, it's almost like a magnetic, some sort of magnetic phenomenon, I think, that this very potent area of our psyche creates a corresponding embodiment outside of us, so that we are then allowed, or often even obliged, to confront our shadow. So then the crazy dame, the femme fatale in the 50s, the alien, the invader, the body snatcher in the 60s, the hippie or the psychopath, and so on. The other has been evolving through American movies, showing our evolving perception of ourselves and of our world.
But the message is still pretty much the same, Jason. We have become disconnected with our primordial source, the unconscious, God, you can call them whatever you wanted to call them. But humanity has become disconnected. What is the solution? The shamanistic journey of unification?
Yeah, it's individuation, is Jung's term. The solution is to own that shadow, so that we allow ourselves to see it within ourselves. We, by definition, we can't actually go to the unconscious. I mean, when we sleep and dream, of course we do, but as a conscious intention to actually uncover areas of the unconscious isn't possible, because how do we know where they are or what they are? When we begin to understand this phenomenon of the projected psyche that Jung talks about, when there's an area of our psyche that we cannot or will not integrate, it begins to materialize outside of us, just in order to have some sort of existence. So then, if we begin to see our lives in this way, which is part of what Secret Life of Movies is about, is this animistic or shamanistic view of reality, which of course is a symptom of schizophrenia also. When we see external events or encounters as embodiments or mirroring phenomenon of disowned emotional, psychological matter, then this potentially allows us to isolate and identify those parts of our psyche that we have disowned by deduction, by intuition, by imagination, things we don't like outside of ourselves, people who act in certain ways that push our buttons, that particularly the most dynamic example is in a relationship. The more deeply in love we are with the person, the more painful it is. Why is that? Because they push our buttons, because they allow us or even force us to go into old childhood patterns of trauma. Because here's this person that we care about more than we've cared about anyone since our mother or our father when we were totally vulnerable. So all of this is a shamanic journey. It's just that we don't fully recognize it, and we're not fully conscious of the potential for transformation in it. So we tend to try and stay on the surface, and that never works. So the solution is to actually go deeper into whatever we're experiencing and allow that seeing to take us deeper into ourselves. And then if we actually see those areas that we've disowned, they, at least my experience seems to be that because we recognize them as ourselves, finally, and not the other, that seeing in itself is enough to draw them back to us. It's like a child that's been disowned, and locked up in the attic because we found it ugly or unpleasing to us, so we just tried to pretend it didn't exist, but we had to feed it and keep it, alive. Eventually, we have to recognize that it is our child, and then that seeing draws it back to us, and then it's integrated into our psyche, and we experience a new degree of wholeness.
Jason, do you see the actual medium of cinema as more conducive to the schizophrenic experience or facing our own schizophrenia? I mean, let's look at what going to the cinema is versus sitting watching TV or a book. I mean, in a cinema, you're basically trapped helplessly in a chair like Alex in A Clockwork Orange. You're in complete darkness, where you almost seem to have no corporal form, along with all these other lost souls, and then you're bathed in frenetic light and narrative until your personality melts away. Do you see do you see the medium as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message?
Yeah, I think that's something I discovered also writing the book, was that not only do movies naturally seem to gravitate towards depicting schizophrenic experiences in terms of intense visionary states and trauma and all the rest of it, the actual act of watching a movie does correlate with what schizophrenia is described as being, which is total passivity and a cut-off from one's perceptions. So there's a split between one's consciousness, one's inner consciousness and one's external reality. So schizophrenics find it very hard to connect. They're sort of adrift in this dream world, which is what could better describe the experience of watching a movie than just letting yourself float off into a dream world. And I think one of the major appeals of movies is that they allow us to experience a simulation of life without being seen. So we can be immersed in this reality and watch these people doing these things, and so it's just as if we're actually there, but there's no chance of being seen, unless you're in a Woody Allen movie, of course.
Yeah, very true.
So I mean, there's something basic about that relief. I think we all have had that feeling of like wanting to be invisible, wanting to be a fly on the wall, because we don't want to be alone and isolated the whole time. That can be suffocating and frightening, but at the same time, even more frightening is the idea of being exposed, of being seen. So movies offer this option of interacting without interacting, of being present and not present. It's sort of a bilocation thing. It's like dreaming also, isn't it? We're safe in our beds, asleep. Could be no more environment more comfortable than when we're asleep. It's a simulation of being in the womb, while our imaginations are roving free. So we have the best of both worlds. So movies also simulate that, the experience of dreaming, which is similar to being in the womb. And then also what you're referring to, this loss of self, being erased, this is something I've only recently recognized, because I've been a movie addict I've actually tried to quit movies.